Anyone ever been, let me start with a better question. Anyone from the state of Utah? That's Utah. Anybody? Okay, no one. All right. Y'all are embarrassed of it. I got it. I'm not telling them. Anyone ever been to Utah? Okay, hey, there we go. I spent some time in Utah with family and some friends not too long ago. We did some national parks. There's 5 of them, little Mighty 5 national park action. They're splendiferous. I was not aware of this fact when we were in Utah, or maybe I might have made a little detour. Anyone ever been to Provo, Utah? Hey, okay, wow. Wow. Okay, yes. Affirmative. Provo, Utah. There is this place in Provo, Utah that I have discovered in just the last few months. It is called Moon's Rare Books, Provo, Utah. Anyone ever been to Moon's Rare Books? Oh, you have. Let's go. That's what I'm talking about. So I didn't know anything about Moon's Rare Books, but on social media, the owner of Moon's Rare Books, I don't know what his name is, probably Mr. Moon. Mr. Moon, he is incredible. He's got this great grandpa storytelling voice. I love to sit and just listen to him. He's got this vault that he goes and pulls out these rare books, and he'll talk about J.R. Tolkien and just like Shakespeare stuff. And he's got the originals. He travels all over the world trying to procure these one-offs or first editions, and he's got this incredible library. Well, he's really great at social media, and so he's just fascinating to watch. So I'll just scroll through him the whole day. It's really good. Well, he actually has this huge section of ancient Bibles, and like really old Bibles. And you can get Bibles that are like $20,000, right? Like that's how much it costs, because they're that rare, they're that old, they're that ancient. One of the things that they offer is you can order online. They've got some Bibles that have fallen apart because they're so old, and you can order pages that they'll pack up for you, and you can order pages from 2 different versions they have right now: a Geneva Bible and a King James Version Bible. But the King James Version is anywhere. They don't tell you which page they're going to send you, but it goes somewhere from 1613 through the early 1800s, and you can purchase it, and they send it to you, and then you have at least minimum 200-something-year-old page from a Bible. Maybe it could be all the way up to 400 years old. And so they're not relative to $20,000. So I ordered one for this message today, so I could show you this. And you're like, oh goodness, what are we talking about? We're gonna get there. So I can show you. And so it's gonna be here tomorrow. Yeah. It is in a sorting facility for the United States Postal Service in Palmetto. It's been there for a few days. I spoke to someone in the United States Postal Service, and they said maybe. I was like, maybe what? Just maybe. Maybe it's there, maybe. Maybe it's not there, maybe. Maybe it'll be here Monday, maybe. Nevertheless, stop by this week, and I will show you. I will show you this one page. And with my luck, I'm not going to get one of the 1600 ones. They're probably going to give me 1821. And probably not even a whole sheet. It'll be the last sheet of, I don't know, something obscure, or maybe out of Leviticus or something. I don't know. You don't get to pick. They just send you a sheet that they've fallen out of the Bible. Anyway, so that'll be here tomorrow. The reason I say that is a couple weeks ago at the close of our Easter gathering, we put up a QR code on the screen, and we said, hey, we're going to use this QR code for one reason. You're either running towards the resurrection of Jesus, or you're running away from it. And if you're running away from it, what is the reason that's causing you to run away from it? What are the questions that you have? What are the theological hurdles, or just the hurdles of faith, whatever it is, that if you could find an answer, that might turn you around to run back towards the resurrection of Jesus. And so we just said, hey, you scan this QR code, you can submit anonymously whatever your questions might possibly be. And we're going to take those questions and find, the most asked questions, and we're going to clear our teaching calendar, and we're going to answer these questions. And so last week's questions went into detail on why does God allow suffering. And so if you want to walk through that was question 1 last week. This week, I've got good news and I've got bad news. Good news is I'm going to answer your question. The bad news is the answer to this question is not very engaging. It's very academic, and we're going to give it a shot anyway. Here's the question. How do we know, and this is a summary of a bunch of different questions that are asking the same thing. How do we know that what we read today in our English Bibles is what was written 2,000 years ago? Yeah. Whew. Okay, y'all are more entertained than 9 o'clock. There were some groans at the 9 o'clock, like, oh, not this. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. It's like, y'all are the early Christians. What are you talking about? You should be ready to go. Y'all have had coffee, I guess. I don't know. And so we're going to answer questions today surrounding authenticity, translation, questions like, hey, we've got so many different English versions of the Bible. Which one's right? And how do we know which one's right? And I'm going to attempt to do all of that in 28 minutes and 13, 12, 11 seconds. So here we go. Let's start with, is what we have reliable? This was a question that was asked last year, and so if you want a more in-depth version of this part of the question, you can go back and look at the full talk that I went more in-depth on last year. So this is going to be the very first, maybe 3-4 minutes, and then we're going to get into the bigger questions. So I just want to walk through as we're trying to figure out a baseline for, is what we read in the Bible authentic or trustworthy? Then we want to ask the question, well, how do we determine the meaning or the litmus test? Like, what's the baseline for us to judge something that's historical as historical? And if we don't understand that, then it makes no sense for us to talk about a biblical record or biblical text. And so we just want to begin with some things that you're probably fairly familiar with. If you're not familiar with the exact work, you are familiar with the events and history that surrounded the work. You probably just don't connect the two together. But let's figure out where our universities and our school systems find the history that we teach in our world history classes. So when we talk about other biblical or ancient artifacts, there's a good little chunk that we can walk through, and I'm going to do this briefly. When we look at Caesar's Gallic Wars, this is a war that was waged between 58 and 50 BC by the Roman general Julius Caesar against the people of Gaul. That's present day, like France, Belgium, Germany, Switzerland, that kind of thing. It was an expansion of the Roman Empire. We teach that in schools. The date that was written was somewhere between 144 BC. The earliest evidence, though, that we have that was written is AD 900, 950 years after it was originally written. And we've only got 10 copies. So we have no copies anywhere close when Caesar's Gallic Wars was actually written. What we do have is 950 years later, we have copies, 10 of them, right or so, about 950 years after it was originally written. When you look at the writings of Plato, this includes the Republic, his best known work, one of the world's most influential works around philosophy and political theory, was written in 427 to 347 BC. The earliest evidence we have of that is 900 AD again, 1,250 years after it was originally written, and we've only got 7 copies of it. We look at Tacitus. He was a Roman historian and politician, widely regarded as one of the greatest Roman historians by any modern scholar. Surviving portions of his 2 major works, Annals and Histories, examine the reigns of Emperor Tiberius, Claudius, and Nero. They span the history of the Roman Empire from the death of Augustus in 14 AD all the way to the death of Domitian in 96 AD. They were written in 100 AD. The earliest evidence we have of it, though, is 1100 AD, 1,000 years after it was originally written. We've got 20 copies. You look at Thucydides, the history of the Peloponnesian War. It recounts the 5th century BC war between Sparta and Athens, written between 460 and 400 BC. 900 AD is our earliest evidence again. 1,400 years afterwards, we got 8 copies. The plays of Sophocles, the most celebrated Greek playwright in history. His expertise was in tragedy, as most of you probably know. He won 24 out of 30 competitions he ever entered as a playwright, so he's super famous and really great at what he does. 496 to 406 is the date it was written. The earliest evidence we have is 1,000 years, or 80,000, 1,400 years afterwards, we got 100 copies. The writings of Aristotle, he covers a wide range of subjects: physics, biology, zoology, metaphysics, poetry, drama, linguistics, economics, all kind of things. 384 to 322 BC, our earliest evidence is 1100 AD, 1,400 years later, and we've got 5 copies of it. Right? So you can kind of see how the chart kind of stacks up, and we're kind of saying, hey, this is what we do in terms of history, and we just tell people that what we read and these things are true, that this is history. That's what we do. Every college, every university across the globe, when they teach the history of the Peloponnesian War, this is what they use. 1,000-year-old accounts of what happened 1,000 years earlier. This is how we do it. Let's talk about the New Testament just briefly. Written somewhere between 40 and 100 AD, give or take a little bit. The earliest evidence we have of this is AD 130, just 30 to 90 years afterwards. In total, we have our first full manuscript around AD 350, just 250 years after. And when we take a look at it, sorry, I just pulled up something weird on my iPad, and I can't get it to go away. There you go. There you go. Slide away. And so when we look at it, in total, we've got 5,000 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin manuscripts, and 9,000 in other languages. Just to put it in proportion in terms of when we look at historical data for historic events, the amount of data that we have in terms of historic manuscripts is far superior than any other historical artifact or event that we have in the history of the world. It's not even close, as you can see. Now, when we think through this, there's some vocab words. I know y'all love vocab words. All y'all are going back to school. Here we go. There's some vocab words we should be aware of, because when Christians who are really smart decide to do things, they never think of normal, ordinary people like you and I. None of them ever do. What they think about is, how can I impress my other smart friends? That's how they name things. It's how they number things. They have no desire for the normal person, which is 99.9% of all Christians, to be able to understand it or walk through it. Zero desire. They think of no one but themselves and whatever they've discovered. That's it. So here's a few, just like, in fact, it's gotten so bad that they are so into what they're doing that we have now words, like really great words, but they don't want to use the words we have, which mean that thing. They would rather call it the old thing, even though we have, I'll give you an example in a second. Not just yet, but we'll get there. First one is papyrus. Now, most of you probably know this word because you've seen it as a font in some kind of graphic creation thing. It's not that. Papyrus is a paper-like writing material, usually put in the form of a scroll or roll made from the reeds of the papyrus plant. Usually it's done on one side. Sometimes it's on both sides. Scrolls were no longer than 35 feet, about 9 or 10 inches tall. To put it in perspective, the book of Matthew, 28 chapters, and Luke is 24 chapters. Each would fit on a scroll about 32 to 35 feet long, right? So when you got a scroll, you're going to open it, and as you're unrolling with one hand, you're rolling up with the other. So it's kind of like this, you know what I'm saying? And if there's that's what it looks like. Except they stand still, and I don't know, it's probably a little more boring. Anyway, papyrus is the oldest thing. If we can find things with papyrus, it's incredible. Problem is, papyrus doesn't last. Like, it might last 10 years. And so in order for us to have papyrus, something bad has to have happened. Someone has to have died, and they put it in a tomb where it's not in close with the weather, or something has to have fallen or caven in to keep air away from the papyrus, because when papyrus hangs out with the air, papyrus just stops. Like, it ceases to exist, right? And so all the papyrus we have, that's the best thing. And most likely, when the original letters of Paul and the original gospel was written, it was probably written on some type of papyrus, which is why it's like, man, if we can find that, that's pretty impressive. After papyrus comes a thing called parchment. It's a writing material made from the processed skins of animals. From the 4th century AD through the Middle Ages, the primary writing material was parchment. Another word used for parchment is vellum, which literally means calf skin. For all of you people who love baby cows, what they would do is, I'm not going to tell you, but you can imagine they're not taking Instagram pictures with them. They're using their insides to write on. So that's what's happening. And thank goodness there wasn't a PETA then. You're going to do, anyway, that's a whole other thing. Now I'm going to get an email from PETA. I'm probably not. You don't know my email. Don't email me. I mean, you can. I should stop. That's really going to turn into bad for us. So here's the example. The word codex. It's a Roman writing tablet. In other words, it's a book with leaves. It's like our modern book. Scholars still love to refer to things as codex or codices. They could just say book, but they don't want to. No, they don't want to, because they'd rather refer to it as codex, because it makes you feel more fancy, like Applebee's. It's Christians for sure. Christians for sure are a huge reason that the Codex gained popularity. An enormous movement happened around the writing of the New Testament where Christians started saying, hey, let's not do these scrolls or anything. They started to put the four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, together in one book. They started putting the writings of Paul together in one book. And eventually, they started putting all of those things in one book that we know today as the Bible. Next vocabulary word, manuscript. This means copied by hand. There's two kinds of manuscripts. Uncials are one of the ones we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today. They're the oldest manuscripts. They are written in all capital letters. They date beginning around the 2nd century AD. We've got about 50 papyri that are dated from the 2nd to 4th centuries, so really close to the time of Jesus. That's one type of manuscript, the uncial says. Again, it's all capital letters. And then we've got minuscules, right, or cursives. They were written in small letters, sometimes cursive style. They date beginning in the 9th century, so a long time after Jesus was here. There's a few really prominent uncials that we want to talk about that really make up a lot of what we understand about the scriptures today, about the Bible today. One of them is called the Vatican manuscript. It comes from the early 4th century, so the 300s. It contains almost the entire Old and New Testament in Greek. 759 leaves of vellum. Anybody remember what vellum means? That's right, baby cow skin. Moo. When I say vellum, you say moo. I'm just kidding. Yeah, 759 leaves of vellum. Each one's about 10 inches square. It's considered to be the most exact copy of the New Testament that's available, and it's located in the Vatican Library in Rome. Now, this one's got a lot of drama around it because it first shows up in a little ledger in the mid-1400s, and people want to see it. Where they're like, hold on, we got this ancient manuscript. We want to go and see this thing. And so people begin to ask the Vatican, hey, can we get in and see it? And they're like, no, you can't. Your filthy hands cannot touch this thing. Your filthy eyes cannot see it. They didn't say that, but something close to that. They're like, no. And so people kept petitioning. They're like, please let us see it. Finally, they let one guy in. They search his pockets, turn him, strip him out, and they'll say, you can't have anything to write with, nothing to write on. And they let him spend 6 hours looking at this manuscript. It's a whole Bible, right? And he's looking at it, it's like, this is special. This is ancient. It's so close to when Jesus was here. It's like, this is really important. And so their thing is we shouldn't hold this in a library. We should publish this for the world to have, right? We should publish this. And the Vatican's like, no. It wasn't until just this past century that people actually have been able to feast their eyes on what this is. In fact, now the Vatican has done a really good job. They have gone so far as to take high-definition copy or pictures of every single page, and you can actually look at it yourself on the Vatican Online Library. Every single page, you have access to it, and you can see it. Looks like that. Second one is Sinaitic manuscript. This was found by a guy named Constantine von Tischendorf. I love the name Tischendorf. $10 to whoever names their next kid Tischendorf. You know what I'm saying? That's a legitimate offer. That's a legitimate offer. $10 coming your way. Tischendorf, he was a scholar who, he just decided, he was a really young guy, and this is early 1800s. He just decided, you know what, I feel like I need to devote my life to putting together the oldest ancient manuscripts of the New Testament. And so he went all over the world searching for ancient manuscripts, trying to find older versions of the Bible than what we had at the time, which at the time wasn't all that old. And so he's searching everywhere. One of his journeys takes him to the foot of Mount Sinai, or traditional foot of Mount Sinai, to a monastery called St. Catherine's. And in 1844, he's there, and in this St. Catherine's library, it wasn't all put together. If you can go to the monastery today, it's quite the journey to get there. But if you get there, for sure, you can go in, and the library, it's nice. They renovated it 10, 12 years ago. And so it's really great. In fact, you can look it up online and see inside. But that's not what it was when Tischendorf went in the 1840s. And so he gets there, and it's just a slew of scrolls and paperwork all over the place. There's baskets and dusty. It's a mess. And so he spends a considerable amount of time looking through these things, and he finds nothing. There's nothing there that interests him. It's this is not what I'm searching for. He's getting ready to wrap up his time there, and there's this kiln. There's this fireplace type, a heater, stove type place. And it's sitting there, and this is where the story goes two separate ways. If you read Tischendorf's diary, he gives a very detailed account of what happens next over not just then, but the coming decades. If you talk to the monks and see like monk history in terms of what happened in the monastery, they have a completely different version of events. And which one is true? The Tischendorf and the monk that he first talked to knows. Nobody else knows. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. Tischendorf says that as he was getting ready to wrap up, he sees this basket of manuscripts sitting next to this little stove. And one of the monks confesses that they were using these old manuscripts to light the fire, because it's like, what else are these old manuscripts used for? And so he started to look at it and realized this is some of the oldest New Testament text, or Old Testament, New Testament, Old Testament text he's ever seen. And so he's like, hey, can we stop lighting fires with this? And they're like, sure. So he takes some of it to his room, and overnight, he begins to read and copy a little bit about it. They let him take about 44 pages of this manuscript away for further examining, all that kind of stuff. It confirms, like, okay, this is legit. Like, this manuscript is one of the oldest one anyone has ever found in the history of the world. And so he's like, this is a find, right? So he goes back to see if he can find the rest of it. He doesn't tell the monks at the time what he found. Like, they don't know. Like, they just think it's all, okay, don't start the fire with it. They have no idea. He goes back, and he can't find it anywhere. Like, it's gone. Like, there's no basket. It's not. He goes through all the stuff. He can't find it. And then he's talking to this monk one night really late. He's talking to this monk, and they're having this conversation. He's telling them what he saw. And the monk's like, hey, I've actually seen one of these. And he's like, yeah? He's like, yeah. And he goes over to a shelf, and he reaches up on the top shelf, and he's got this, like, velour bag. I don't know if it's velour. It's just some kind of bag. And he takes his bag down, and he pulls out all of the other pieces that were a part of the original find. Someone gathered them together, put them in a bag, and they had been sitting there. And so he finds, he's like, oh, this is it. This is what I've got the missing pieces to this. This is the whole thing. Like, this is huge. And so that's when he's like, hey, we need to send this to get a copy. So they send it to Cairo, Egypt, 110,000 lines of copy, to copy it from this old thing into something that can be read today to kind of save it and preserve it. And then it's supposed to go back to the monastery. So the monks say that when they say, hey, we would like to have it back, it's supposed to come back. Something happens. It becomes a gift to a Russian czar. And so it goes from Sinai and to Egypt to a Russian czar. And even today, the monks would say it should be back here at St. Catherine's, but it's not. Anybody want to guess where it is? It's been scrolling on the screen for 10 minutes. London and the British Library. How did it go from a Russian czar to London? I don't know. You can go research it yourself. But there it is, 4th century manuscript, so in the 300s, right? The oldest complete manuscript of the New Testament available today is the Sinaitic manuscript. Third uncial that's just huge, Alexandrian manuscript. It was kept in Alexandria, Egypt, for a number of centuries. It was in Constantinople in 1621, presented to King Charles I of England in 1627. It contains most of the Old and New Testament. It has 773 leaves of vellum, and these pages are about 12.5 by 10.5 inches. It's also in London in the British Library. Now, those three are the oldest complete copies that we have. However, we've got pieces and fragments and copies of individual books from the Bible that are much older than those manuscripts. And the way that we have this little system is we put a number P because they're written on papyrus, which is better than parchment because it means it's older. And papyrus has a number, and they will number each one of these. And so I'm going to walk you through just a few of the really important ones. P1 contains 15 verses from Matthew chapter 1. It's from the 3rd century, so the 200s. Its location today, you can go see it, is at Philadelphia and the University of Pennsylvania. Then there's P4, P64, and P57. These fragments, though not originally thought this way, as they started to study it, realized they're from the same codex. Codex is another word for what? Book. Yep, from the same book. Late 2nd century, so the 100s, right? The location of these, P4 is in Paris, France at the National Library. P64 is in Oxford at Magdalene College. And P57 is in the National Library at Vienna, Austria. P5. This contains several chapters of the Gospel of John in the 3rd century. It's currently located in London in the UK in the British Library. I've never really wanted to go to London until I started really looking in. It's like, man, they got everything in London. You know what I'm saying? Anybody want to go? I think it would be a great library trip. P38. This contains part of Acts 18 and 19. It's from the late 3rd century. It's currently located in Ann Arbor, Michigan at the University of Michigan Library. P45, 46, and 47. These are part of the Beatty Papyri, which if you're taking notes, I would just write down Beatty Papyri. You can Google how that whole thing works. I would tell you the whole story, but I don't have enough time. I'm running out of time really fast. So, but you would put down Beatty Papyri. It's a really good story, and it tells you a lot about how that whole thing happened. So, P45 contains part of the 4 Gospels and the book of Acts. P46 has almost all of Paul's letters, and P47 is about a third of the book of Revelation. 3rd century. P45 is in Vienna, Austria National Library. 46 is in University of Michigan Library in Ann Arbor. And P47 is in Dublin in the Chester Beatty Library. P66 has almost all of the first 14 chapters of John. This is late 2nd century, early 3rd century, and it is located in the Bodmer Foundation Library and in the Museum Switzerland. P72 is a Bodmer papyrus. Bodmer is another name that you want to Google, and you can look into how that whole thing happens. It's got 1st and 2nd Peter and Jude in complete form, 3rd or 4th century, and it's also located in the Vatican Library. P75 is a Bodmer papyrus, parts of Luke and John, the earliest known copy of Luke and one of the earliest of John, late 2nd, early 3rd century, and it's located in the Vatican Library. And then P90 and P104, 2nd century, they both have portions of Matthew 21 and John 18 and 19. And this was found actually in a discovery with a bunch of writings from Sophocles and Aristotle, located in Oxford, United Kingdom, in the Sackler Library. And then finally, the oldest is P52. It's got John 18, 31 through 33, verse 37, and verse 38. This comes from the first half of the 2nd century. It's the oldest papyrus we've ever found, located in Manchester at John Rylands University Library. These are just 10 fragments out of tons of fragments. And when you begin to put all of them together, while they're just fragments, we've got fragments of all of it, right? Just not all in the same place at the same time. We got fragments of all of it spread out over all crazy countries, all over the place. And yet fragments from one end of the globe to the other say the same thing. It's wild. And then they fill in the gaps and they fill in the holes where one might be missing verses or this, that, or the other. The historical evidence for the reliability of the biblical text is unmatched. However, that doesn't answer the question if we can trust our English translation and the various versions of the Bible that we have. Now, when you're thinking through this, it's a really good question. Like, okay, great. So we've got enough text of biblical ancient manuscripts to make a Bible, but how do we know when we translate an ancient language that it's actually saying what it was supposed to say? When you think about the top 10 Bibles in the United States, from 2023, they go like this. The New Revised Standard Version, number 10. Number 9, the New American Standard Bible. Number 8, New International Reader's Version. That one, for just to let you know, that's the one that we will give to kids. It's the Lexile level for it is much lower. It's also really great for someone who's learning English as a second language and they're really just getting into the English language. It's written in a way that's like, okay, I can get this. So that's what the New International Reader's Version is. Number 7 is the Reina Valera. I don't know if I pronounced that right, but it's Spanish. What's that? Thank you, ma'am. That's right. That's right. I can always count on you. Number 6 is the New King James Version. Number 5, Christian Standard Bible. Number 4, New Living Translation. Number 3, English Standard Version. Number 2, the King James Version. And number 1, the New International Version. So those are 10 Bibles. And it's like, all right, so they all come from the same little text, like all that kind of stuff, right? Is that how it works? And how do we have all these different translations of one thing? Like, why wouldn't it just be one English translation? So when you look at the Bible, it's broken up into kind of a spectrum. You go all the way from a very literal translation where they're going to go word for word as best they can from ancient language to English. And they're going to word for word, very literal. In the middle, it would be a thought for thought. Like, okay, so if we do something that's very literal, there's probably words to describe something we would have no idea why it applies. And so word for word doesn't really help us. But thought for thought, it's like, okay, we want to communicate what the thought of the ancient culture is into this moment. And then there's paraphrases, which is more like idea for idea, right? And so they kind of fit into that spectrum. I don't have enough time to go into every one of those 10 to tell you where it goes on the slide, but you can. It's a simple Google to say, hey, what is the spectrum of English Bibles? And there will be charts that show you where does the Bible fall on this literal to thought for thought to idea for idea. And it'll show you where the Bible is, or whichever version you're thinking about reading. But I want to talk about just two, for example. Just to walk through a couple of them. The first one is the King James Version, the KJV. For sure, over the last 400 years, the most popular version, English version of the Bible. Now, to understand the KJV and kind of how it works, we've got to understand a little bit more history. Greek manuscripts of the New Testament are categorized into three groups: Alexandrian, Western, and Byzantine. Alexandrian, it comes from Alexandria, Egypt. It was an ancient center of academic excellence and scholarship. Scholars view Alexandrian manuscripts as the best copied and most accurate manuscripts, right? Western manuscripts, it's the second type, come from a much wider area, extends from North Africa to France and east into Syria. Western manuscripts appear to have less oversight over the copying process when compared with Alexandrian manuscripts. And the third category is Byzantine manuscripts. They come from Constantinople. 80% of all existing Greek manuscripts are in this category. That's why sometimes Byzantine manuscripts will be called the majority text. Byzantine manuscripts are considered the least accurate, as there is evidence of expanding or smoothing out passages by copyists. In other words, there's a lot of editorializing that happened inside of the Byzantine manuscripts. So there's three different groups of manuscripts that we have to choose from. Alexandrian, those are the best. Western, mid-grade. And the worst manuscripts we have in terms of what we want. Does it reflect actually what was written in the first century? Byzantine would come in third on that list. The New Testament in the King James Version comes from the Byzantine manuscripts. The foundation of the King James Version started in 1516, so it's finished in 1611, but it begins, at least the foundation of it starts in 1516. There's a guy by the name of Erasmus. He's a Dutch scholar. He publishes the first Greek New Testament, which we know as today it becomes known as the Textus Receptus, or the received text, using Byzantine manuscripts from the 12th and 13th century. So remember, 12th, 13th century, we've got manuscripts now from the 2nd century, 3rd century, 4th century that are all in unison. You fast forward and it's like, okay, we're starting to see that this isn't quite the same, right? It's not going to be the same. Now, the thing is that Erasmus himself, this foundational piece, he actually said, hey, no less than 4 times he edited his own work because of how many issues there were in the translation. In 1519, 1522, 1527, and 1535. And with that, the King James Version, in addition to Erasmus' Textus Receptus, or received text, they also used a few other Bibles that were in print beforehand to make up the King James. First, they used the Bishop's Bible of 1568. Now, the interesting thing about the Bishop's Bible is it was just a revision of the Great Bible in 1539. And the Great Bible was just a revision of Matthew's Bible in 1537. And Matthew's Bible was only a revision of Coverdale's first Bible in 1535, which also included a ton of work by a guy named William Tyndale in 1535 as well. Now, William Tyndale's story is incredible. It is like one of the most fascinating, incredible movements. So all of these guys I just mentioned really contributed to furthering the understanding of God's desire for humanity through the biblical text. And you should just read about William Tyndale in and of himself. It's absolutely incredible. And as a whole, the King James has served an incredible purpose. And for 4 centuries, it introduced people to the story of Jesus. However, followers of Jesus need to be the very first and the quickest to raise our hand and say, hey, we found better work. We found manuscripts. We found evidence that was closer to the time of Jesus that show the King James Version might not be as accurate as we wanted it to be. We don't want to hide this. We don't want to hide it and say, oh, well, hopefully the world doesn't realize. Because if you talk to some folks, they'll say, hey, when we read these new modern Bibles, it seems to be missing a lot. In fact, they'll say it's missing like 15%. Well, it's not missing 15%. It's that when we go back and look at the Byzantine manuscripts, it's that it was editorialized so much that they added 15%. That there's so much in those 12th and 13th century manuscripts that were editorialized that doesn't show up in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th century manuscripts. It's just not there. Yet all the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th century manuscripts agree that it wasn't there. Now, this creates tension, and it makes sense. When you have 400 years of history, 250 or so years here in the United States, and it's like, man, this is a big deal. And we come from where the King James Version came from, right? 1611. It crosses the seas with us, you know? Like, this is a big deal. And so when you start to say, hey, we got to be honest that there were some really well-intended guys that kind of added some things that weren't in the Bible to that. They kind of gave their own spin on some things. We should just be honest about it. Now, it creates tension. It creates a lot of tension. In fact, there's this thing on social media that's going around just the last couple of weeks. I don't know if you saw it. I'll just show it to you.
The King James Bible is the Word of God, every word of it. Amen. I can take this book and correct the Greek. Amen.
People are very passionate about it, and I think passion is good. I think it's a good thing. But the reality is we can't take anything in English and correct the Greek, right? Greek comes first. And I think it's important for us as followers of Jesus to be okay with moments in our history when we didn't quite get it right. And to be the first to say, hey, we didn't quite get it right. There's stories behind every version of the Bible. We typically will teach out of the New International Version. In 1955, a man by the name of Howard Long, he was an engineer from Seattle and a follower of Jesus, was having a conversation with someone who was disconnected from faith. And he was trying to share with him a few Bible verses. And he had a King James Version, so he opened it up and he begins to share it. But the guy's got more questions because the language just didn't connect. 17th century English just wasn't doing it. And so he decided to pursue an updated version. 10 years later, in 1965, a cross-denominational gathering of scholars met near Chicago and agreed to start work on the New International Version. They started thinking they were just going to refresh the language of the King James, but the more they got into it, they realized that's not what our world needed, that we had so much new biblical evidence that we should just start from scratch. And so they did, using the very best manuscripts available in the original Greek, Hebrew, and Aramaic of the Bible, including every single one that I've mentioned and shown you pictures of today. None of which, not a single papyrus or manuscript that I showed you was used in the King James translation. In 1969, that group published their first gospel, was the Gospel of John. In 1973, they finished the New Testament. In 1978, the first full Bible was published in contemporary English. Since then, they've revived it to keep the language updated for the world we live in 1984, 2011, and in 2022. For sure, biblical translation has its challenges. How do you take a language and thoughts that are 2,000 years old, and for an Old Testament that's even older than that, and put them in language that we understand? I think the New International Version has done a really good job in the cross-denominational side of their scholarship. I believe that the NIV is trustworthy. So, at the end of the day, though, what does this really teach us? What does the Bible that we have in our own language tell us? Well, the first thing it tells us is that there's an old covenant and a new covenant. Now, what's interesting is this would be much more obvious if we would actually take the same principles we've done inside the Bible and use it on the cover of the Bible. You see, testament is an old English word that means covenant or agreement between two parties. Now, when we hear the word testament, we don't think of covenant. We think of last will and testament, or I'm going to testify in court. And that's the vision that our current culture gets, but it is not what it means at all. No, it was a term that was used to translate the Hebrew word and the Greek word for covenant. And at the time when we labeled in English the Bible, we took that translation, and instead of using the word covenant, we used the word testament because it made sense a few hundred years ago. But the truth is that the real title of our Bible is the Bible, Old Covenant and New Covenant. And the Old Covenant tells us something very special. It shows us a cause and effect. Old Covenant is this: sin establishes the need for Jesus. It's that simple. And the New Covenant also shows us a cause and effect. The New Covenant is this: Jesus solves the sin problem and establishes the need for the church. Now, I'll be honest with you, I have dreaded standing up here and doing this since I got the questions 2 weeks ago. I, for sure, am not a professor. And as I think through the enormity of the weight of what we're attempting to cover, I know that I haven't even started to scratch the surface on the things you ought to know. So we want to make it very practical. So we've got a couple of resources, one of which we've already sold out of today. I severely underestimated the amount of reading people wanted to do after this. And I thought I got a lot, but evidently I didn't get a lot. So we got 2 books, one of which is still on campus, and I'll walk you through this. The first one is Why I Trust the Bible. Now, we used this resource last year to answer the first little tiny snippet, that chart I went through. This gets a lot into that. It goes even further into a bunch of things. This was written by an incredible scholar that has a really great knack for taking high-level scholarship and bringing it down to something that you and I could read. It's really good. Now, we don't have any more of these copies here, but we do, at the blue tent outside, we have a QR code where you can just scan it, and it's a link directly to Amazon if you want to grab it. I believe they're $10. And so that's this one. And then this is also a really great resource. It's called How We Got the Bible, and we've got some copies of this one that's left. Now, of the 2, this one is my favorite because it goes into some of the stories about the Vatican manuscript and how the Vatican didn't want to let people see it and the whole story behind it. It goes into Constantine von Tischendorf and his journeys to St. Catherine's, and it walks through that. It does a really good job at all the papyri that I showed you, the ones that have the numbers next to them. It does a really good deep dive on that. Both of them are really great resources. And you can buy them out there. It's the same cost for Amazon. It actually might be a little cheaper. We just kind of did a round number, and we wanted to make sure that you had access to them today. So this one is sold out. This one we do have some more copies of. Both of them we have a QR code outside for you to grab, and they'll be at the blue tent just outside by the ice cream truck. You know, we've looked at a bunch of pictures today of papyrus and vellum or parchment. Yep. I asked for it. But I'll tell you this, there's actually a bit of evidence that's even older than all of that. In 1979 in southwest Jerusalem, there was a professor that was leading a group of students on a little excavation. And there was a site that had already been excavated. It had been excavated a number of times, actually. And so it wasn't that the professor wasn't looking for anything. He was just helping students go through the process, right? And so they hop in there and they start this process of excavating a site. And if for those of you who have taught or done anything where you like lead students, you know, there's usually like one student that just is a little needy, just like needs a little extra care. Sometimes it's like right up under you the whole time. And maybe, I mean, you might use the word annoying, or it could be just like, I don't know, you find another nicer word for it, right? Either way. So there's a student in here. And so he's like, and so the professor says, hey, okay. Go down in that hole and clean up. And so to tell you about the hole, it was this little place. It's a burial place. The roof is gone, but or the top of the cave is gone. But it's an open air burial place, and it didn't used to be open air, but now it is. And there's little places where you would put a body. It's got a headrest where the head would lay. And what they would do is after someone had passed away, they'd take the body and put it in there, and they would seal it up, and it would go through the decomposition process. They would come back later and collect the bones because it's perfectly laid out in the shape of a body. They would collect the bones, put it in a box, and they would take the box and they would put it under that stone slab underneath where they would store bone boxes of sometimes with a family or whatever. And so where the professor told the guy to go, or the little kid to go, the student to go, he said, go under there, which is where they would put the bone boxes. It's all been excavated. There's no bone boxes in there, none of that kind of thing, right? And so he goes down there, and he's gone, and the professor's thinking, okay, this is going to take 45 minutes or so. He'll be gone. He's done. Like, I've given him something to do. And he is back pretty quick. And when he comes back, he's got his hand, and in his hand is this little tiny vase. It's about 3 or 4 inches tall, and it's intact. It's like this purple, greenish, blue vase, like a vase, but it's got a little teapot handle on it. It's not a teapot, but it's got a little handle. That's what it reminds me of. And I wish I had a picture. I should have had a picture. But it's just like it fits in the palm of your hand. And so he's like, hey, look what I found. And so the professor looks at it, and he's like, and immediately he's like, that's like crazy old. Where'd you find this? And he's like, it's in the hole where you told me to go, you know? And so all of a sudden they're like, okay. And so they start looking. Well, what happened was underneath this little burial chamber, the ceiling, which was all stone, about 4 or 5 inches of it collapsed. And so a new floor was made. And so when they excavated, they didn't get all the way through or past it. And so they started uncovering this thing, and they found over 1,000 artifacts underneath the ceiling that had collapsed. Now, again, there's still a ceiling there, but it was just a piece, just a piece of it had collapsed. And as they started pulling out, they started realizing that all of these things, they're not like just a little old. They are crazy old, like 600-700 years BC old, like before Jesus old, which is wild because up until this moment, there was no evidence or no archaeological evidence of the Bible or the Old Testament existing prior to the first destruction of the temple, which happened in 586 AD by the Babylonians. All right, once that temple was destroyed, there's no evidence that predated it. Nothing written down, none of that. And as they started to dig through this, they find 2 tiny little amulets. They're like little scrolls, and they're rolled up really tight. They start studying them, and they're 99% silver. And they're teeny tiny. And so it takes 3 years for them to figure out how to unroll these amulets. 3 years. I don't know who the person was that was finally like, just let me see it, right? And then like just what we want to know what's on the amulet. It's a scroll. What's on the scroll, right? These silver, little tiny silver. Now, when I say tiny, I mean once they were unrolled, they're like 4 inches by 1 inch, like this by this. In fact, we've got some pictures of them. Now, what's great about these scrolls is what's written on them. It's the oldest evidence of the existence of the Bible. It's a passage from the book of Numbers, chapter 6, 24 through 26. And it says this: "The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine on you and be gracious to you. The Lord turn his face toward you and give you peace. This is what is referred to in the Jewish world as the priestly blessing. It was words that were spoken over numerous Jewish individuals that were devoted to living a life following an idea of monotheism, that there's only one true God. So much so that they had jewelry made with this blessing on it that they would wear and carry around with them, because it was something that was spoken over their lives. What's wild is maybe you are not a great student of the book of Numbers in the Old Testament, but that passage probably sounds familiar to you if you spent time at Foundation, because while a priest has likely never spoken it over you, our worship leaders have sung it over you for years. These are words that, because of the Bible, can still be shared today, 2,600 years later. Words that were worn as jewelry, prayed and spoken over congregations giving their lives to God, and the very words we sing today, that has withstood the test of time for more than 2,600 years.